Well, I think the major thing is that after the general election results last week, we're now in a rather different political environment, and the Welsh Government are attempting to influence the debates that go on. We were expecting before the election Theresa May to emerge with a big majority to pursue the sort of hardish Brexit that she seemed to be edging towards. Now, of course, the UK government has no parliamentary majority. Theresa May is having to sort of look for friends, and the Welsh government finds itself in a position where it's seeking to influence the debate at a time when things seem to be up for consideration again. So the Welsh government is pushing forward its views on single market access and on restructuring the UK around Brexit issues, and I think they seem to have, perhaps more by luck than judgment, arrived at the perfect time to be doing so.
For many years we've had this concept of parliamentary sovereignty. I don't buy that anymore, I'm afraid. I don't see why it is that there should be one institution that effectively is the font of all power in the UK, namely Westminster, and it's Westminster's role to dole out power as it sees fit, which is the current constitutional position.
Well, the First Minister and the Welsh Government in this new document are proposing some pretty fundamental restructuring of the United Kingdom. They're proposing the introduction for the first time of genuine shared rule, where elements of power would be shared between the different governments of the UK. The UK government would not be in a position to dictate to the other governments what can happen in some areas. He's proposing essentially the abolition, more or less, of the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. This is really radical stuff. And to some degree this follows on from the sorts of things the First Minister at least has been saying for a while. But to see the whole of the Welsh Government very much putting themselves behind this, to have seen in the election campaign the Labour Party manifesto committing the parties across the UK to supporting much of this, I think is very interesting and very important.
I can see the sense in the four governments agreeing not to effect change in the early stages of those powers coming back. I can understand that in order to create stability. But there are two approaches that can be taken here. The first one is to say everything sits in London until London decides what it wants to give out, which is not an approach that we favour. Or we can all say, okay, when it comes to areas like farming and fisheries, there is a need for some commonality between the four governments, but let's agree on that.
For me, what I thought was particularly interesting was the proposal of a Council of Ministers to replace the Joint Ministerial Committee. So this is, how is the UK going to, as a union of four nations, going to organise itself post-Brexit when it comes to creating those supposedly commonly created frameworks that are going to replace those EU frameworks. So what the Welsh Government is proposing is that we move from a JMC, which is more like a talking shop, to a Council of Ministers that is actually a decision-making body. So you have these four nations within the UK coming together to make decisions about these common frameworks that will be agreed ideally through a consensus-seeking approach. If not, the initial proposal is to do this through a UK plus one government in order to agree these common frameworks.
And I think reading through the document, anyone with any knowledge or understanding of EU matters will see things that will jump out, terms and ideas and concepts that we're familiar with from an EU perspective. So we talk about pooling of sovereignty, the institutions of a Council of Ministers, and also the idea of an internal market that's been so central to the EU's existence, that the idea that that internal market. In the UK, we have an internal market mainly because the EU has done that work for us. Now, with the EU gone, taking that away, what's going to happen domestically, internally, if we have got sort of scope for different rules to be taken by Wales, by Scotland, by England, then potentially we're going to have different regulations, and that might be problematic for an internal market. Different rules create greater costs, create barriers to trade, and so that's part of this issue of how do we work together, how do we respect devolution, subsidiarity, and yet at the same time, how do we work together as part of a larger union? So the questions that are being raised here are ones that we've sort of lived through over decades with the European Union.
What is agreed is owned by four. What is dictated is only owned by one. And that means that, for example, if we felt that things were being imposed on us, we would resist that. That's not what I want. I don't want to be in a position where we have an ongoing battle with the UK government over what is and what isn't devolved. I'd much rather we said, okay, let's put the structure in place now where we can all agree.
I mean, quite what Welsh Government resistance to UK imposition would mean, we don't know. But I think generally since the Brexit referendum, not least because Wales voted for Brexit and that rather undermined the bargaining position of the Welsh Government, Wales has been in a fairly weak bargaining position. Both Scotland and Northern Ireland have been effectively able to say to London, look, we didn't vote for Brexit, and if you push this through in a form which we don't like, we can make life difficult for you. We can make things happen that you don't want to happen. Wales hasn't been in that position. I think lots of people have felt it's largely been ignored. But now, post-general election, lots of things seem to be in flux. There's a possibility maybe for Wales to reinsert itself into the debate. The sorts of things that the First Minister is proposing about the UK and about devolution are quite radical. He's been saying things like this for quite a long time. For much of that period, he hasn't even been able to carry the rest of his party with him. But now he seems to have brought much of Welsh Labour and indeed much of the UK Labour Party behind him. And after the general election result that we had in Wales, with the First Minister very much having been the lead of the Welsh Labour campaign, I think he is a much strengthened figure within his party. The overall election result also potentially allows him and Wales to try and influence the UK-wide debate in a more fundamental way than they've been able to so far. So, in a sense, some of these points are points he's been making before. He's having now the go at them, but maybe in a context in which he has more of a chance to actually make them hit home.